My name is Jim Secord, and I'm director of the Darwin Correspondence Project in the University Library at Cambridge University in England. Welcome to my exp. For Darwin, natural selection was the main, but certainly not the only mechanism by which new species came into being. So the idea that those who were most well adapted to the circumstances and hence more likely to survive than others went on to reproduce, and then that became the basis for new species, that idea of natural selection became absolutely central to evolutionary biology, what was known as the modern synthesis. And so from the 1930s, this provides the basis for a huge revival of Darwin's reputation. So by the time you reach 1959, and certainly 2009, when I was involved, Darwin's reputation is really incredibly high. There's even in 1959 a musical that's put on about Darwin's life in Chicago, and there's songs. You can actually buy the record on eBay. So it's quite extraordinary how Darwin moves from this position of really being just one of many Victorians who had talked about evolution and a significant figure, an interesting figure, but he becomes something that's actually much more than that. He becomes the singular founder who had seen into the key of the crucial problem for identifying how evolution took place. So that provides the basis, I think, for the modern way that Darwin has actually been viewed. That provided the way for how people began to think about Darwin in many, many other fields of endeavor. One area where I think we can see Darwin's thinking as being particularly important and powerful is in medicine. When we are facing the prospect of having to create a vaccine against a virus, not just this year, but potentially next year and the year after and the year after that, what we're thinking about there is that the virus is actually evolving through the process of natural selection and changing so that it's better adapted to resist the vaccines that we're putting out there against it. And so for us to deal with that process, we have to be able to prepare new vaccines that, in some sense, are going to be able to fight against those new tools, new resistance that particular virus has that it's developed. And these kinds of developments are really, these kinds of issues are really fundamental for the way that people who work in epidemiology think about the problems they're dealing with. So Darwinian thought, Darwinian natural selection's really fundamental and significant there. I think the other area where we often think about Darwinian issues is in questions of religion and ethics. And here I think it's really important to realize what a subtle and often ambiguous thinker Darwin is. He's somebody that I think we really can use in many, many important ways to help us think through these questions. I'm involved with editing Charles Darwin's letters, and I was really very struck that in an auction a year or two ago, the most expensive Darwin letter that ever has sold before, sold for over $100,000, was one that purportedly proved Darwin was an atheist. But in fact, not surprisingly, it proves nothing of the sort. Darwin's writing to somebody who's asked him about his religious beliefs, and basically what he says is that he's just not sure. He is clearly, though, he said, not a believer in Jesus, not a Christian. He's very clear about that. But in terms of whether he's in a position to understand who and what God is, he says we're in no better position to understand that than, say, a dog is to understand the mind of Isaac Newton. Darwin, in that sense, was very modest about these kinds of questions, and he doesn't see the principle of natural selection as ruling out a belief in religion. He encourages friends of his who actually are religious to believe that natural selection is the law that God has introduced in order to make possible the various species and the world we see around us, the diversity of life. So people tend, I think, to have these rather simplistic views of Darwin, almost caricatures like the ones that were done of him when he was still alive. And I think that really doesn't do justice to what he's actually saying. I've personally found the best thing to do is to take some of the important passages of Darwin's writings and really read very carefully what he says. And the other thing I've always liked doing is reading his letters. Partly that's, of course, because I have to. I'm involved in editing them. But it's really, I think, the letters show Darwin in terms of someone who's not just out there talking to people. He's actually somebody who's engaged in discussion and debate. He writes to something like over 2,000 people of all different walks of life, different nationalities. He writes to Bantu tribe leaders of various groups in Africa. He's very much involved in Central European debates about species and origins. He writes to American doctors and veterinarians, and he's discussing and debating his ideas with all these different people. And he gets information from these people as well. So I think thinking about Darwin as someone who's very much engaged with both his readers and also his correspondence is, I think, a much better way of thinking about the kind of way we might tackle what he's saying.